Hello, everyone, and welcome to this DPU Dialogues in Development. We're very pleased to have all the participants here and the panelists. Today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting book that's been published recently, and I was very pleased to be part of this book, also called Overlooked Cities, and subtitle Shifting the Gaze in Overlooked Cities, Power, Politics, and Knowledge Beyond the Urban South. And today we're going to be looking particularly at the environmental aspects that were discussed in the book. And the book focuses on the idea of overlooked cities, the smaller urban centers, the medium urban centers, those cities that are not the ones that are central in the debates on policy and planning, but yet are very important because they house a huge amount of our world's population. And I'm very happy to say that there's also a website for this book, and we'll look at that during the session. You can see the URL there. So today, our panelists are going to be discussing the complex processes and implications of overlooking in some environmental related fields in the book through looking at climate change, planning, and disaster risk management. So in this, we're going to shift our gaze from the big cities to the smaller and more regional cities like Bharatpur in Nepal, Santa Fe in Argentina, and Manizales in Colombia, as well as Bandar Lampung, Semarang, and Bontang in Indonesia. So we're going to think about why and how it matters for environmental justice debates to look at these smaller cities. So I'm very happy that we have 5 speakers and 4 presentations that are from chapters in the book. So we have Dr. Isolde de Villiers, who is from the Department of Mercantile Law, University of the Free State, South Africa. Dr. Hannah Rusick, Department of Geography, Durham University in the UK. Dr. Erwin Nugara from the Department of Technology, Policy and Society at the University of Twente, Netherlands, and also from the Resilience Development Initiative in Indonesia. And Dr. Maria Evangelina Filippi from the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol, and Dr. Julia Wesley from the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at UCL. And I am Cassidy Johnson. I'm the chair of the Environmental Justice, Urbanisation and Resilience Cluster, which is one of the 4 research clusters at DPU. And so we've organized this session in light of the work of that cluster. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start with our panelists. First of all, I'm very pleased that Dr. Erwin has organized interpreter into Indonesian. So if you need to access that, please do. And also, and put anything in the chat if you have any issues about that. And secondly, if you could please put any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we'll look at them at the end of the session. We're going to have a maximum of 10 minutes per presentation, and then the rest will be a discussion at the end. So please put your questions as you think of them, and we'll look forward to discussing them at the end. So I'd like to start with Isolde, please, if you'd like to share your screen, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just start by thanking DPU for this really wonderful opportunity to share this book, but to also speak to you, and how strange and simultaneously strange, but also wonderful are these times in which we can really connect from different places in the world to share ideas and new ideas. So I am tasked with giving you an introduction to the book and an introduction to this panel today. So allow me to do 3 things. I will firstly just say briefly where this book comes from. And then secondly, I will briefly touch on the main themes and the central argument of the book. And then Lastly, I will speak a little bit about the relationality of the book. In other words, what is new and what is not so new in the book. So, of course, this is the book, as you also saw, shared by Cassidy, the cover. I'm going to ask you just to stop sharing your screen if possible, because I'm unable to do so at the moment, but I should be. Thank you very much. So to tell you where our book comes from, I'm going to share with you this our website, and it should be sharing with you now. There you go. Share screen. Great. So the book includes 13 cities. It's 8 chapters contributed by 12 different authors, and we really come from diverse and different backgrounds, different disciplines, using different methodologies, and really working on different places and in different spaces. This is on our website. Also, the URL also available on the invitation, as you saw, overlookedcities.org. And this is a map that we've included in the book, but also on the website. So what this map does is, of course, in the first place, it challenges us to look differently. And I'll get back to that as a central argument of the book. It asks us to look differently, but it also asks us to speak differently. It introduces new names, new terminologies. As we say these cities, maybe we haven't heard of these cities before. We haven't spoken these words. So Manizales, Trujillo, Arequipa, Santa Fe, Bloemfontein, Mangaung, Pretoria, Tshwane, Bandar Lampung, Semarang, Delhi, Bontang, Lutso, Bharatpur, Zarka. It's a new language, and with the names of these cities, we also want to draw attention to the new terminologies that we want to introduce with this book. So it asks of us to speak differently, but of course it also asks of us to then imagine differently, to imagine what those places look like, what it is to live, and what the everyday lives of ordinary inhabitants of these cities look like and feel like. So of course there's this site, but then also another site produced by one of the contributors, which is translated, and that can be accessed by other colleagues. If you want to refer people also to this site, there is the URL for it. I'm going to give you a minute to take that down if you're interested, and then I will stop sharing. Let me move on to main argument and some of the central themes, the 2 central themes that we address in the book. So, of course, the point of departure, or the central argument of the book, is, of course, really an awareness of the politics of looking, and this includes your let me just stop sharing. Sorry about that. Stop sharing. Standpoint, position, what you look at and what you don't, and the politics involved in that. What happens when you look and the gaze is not returned, violence of that, but also what happens when something is overly looked at. And I think the panel addresses all of these modes of looking and the politics involved in that. So definitely our question in the book shifted from, why does it matter to look at these cities? And of course, I've mentioned because of the lives of the inhabitants who live in them, but then shifted to, why is it important to what happens when we look at these cities, and what happens in that gazing and shifting the gaze? And the panelists will address that. So the 2 central themes of the book is divided into 2 themes. Firstly, power and politics in overlooked cities, and then secondly, the production and negotiation of knowledge in overlooked cities. Hannah's presentation, it forms part of the power and politics theme, and Erwin, Maria, and Julia's papers under the theme of production and negotiation of knowledge in overlooked cities. So apart from these themes, there are other emerging trends also in the book that we identify. And thereby where they present the possibility of another methodology. All of the chapters in the book, and you're welcome to take a look, the table of contents is available on Routledge's website. They all address relationality and challenge preconceived temporalities and set trajectories of cities. Overlooked cities require and open up another kind of methodology. The different chapters follow different methods and are located in different approaches, in some instances combining these approaches in one chapter. In the interest of continued research on overlooked cities, we want to single out relationality and critical trajectories as core themes illustrated by the unique features in these cities. And that is also then our invitation to you for the continued research, for those of you who are interested in that. So let me then end with what is new and what is not so new. So of course, overlooked cities, we stand in relation to existing concepts, and we are in conversation with and also indebted to existing concepts, and different authors in the book use these different notions, such as intermediary cities, the global south, post-colonialism, decolonialism, rogue urbanism, subaltern urbanism, ordinary cities, secondary cities, minor cities, post-abyssal thinking. All of these feature in the book to some extent. So in that sense, it is not new. But what we like to present to you today, I think, is really a new way, and a way in which this challenges existing narratives and really shifts the gaze when it comes to environmental justice debates. So on that note, I give over to Hannah for the first paper. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Isolde. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm at Durham, physically in my office for a change, and I'm going to bring you to Nepal with my chapter. But before I start, I wanted to thank Julia and Cassidy for giving us this opportunity to talk about our book at UCL DPU today. In March, Isolde brought us to South Africa to talk about our book at a faculty research day for law at the University of Free State. And so we had to think through our chapters in relation to law, which for me was a bit scary, but actually it was really useful for thinking about the work. And now it's environmental justice, which again sort of unnerved me a bit when when Julia suggested it. And I thought, actually, you know, there's a huge amount that I can speak to in terms of environmental justice. So I will give it a try now. My chapter doesn't speak directly to environmental justice if we think about informal settlements and the very poor. Rather, my chapter speaks to the ideas of knowledge, justice, legal issues, and then the impact on the physical environment. In my understanding of environmental justice, it's the fair treatment and meaningful treatment of all people, regardless of their background. Environmental justice is an important part of the struggle to improve and maintain an equitable life for all, but especially those who have to live, work, and play near to the impacts of degradation. So Nepal is rapidly urbanizing. It has a population of about 30 million people. It's heterogeneous. There's about 123 languages spoken in Nepal. And there's regular waves of migration to the plains of Nepal, which border India. And Nepal as a country is heavily reliant on international remittances, which are about 30% of GDP at the moment and increasing. These photographs will show you the everyday environment of the city that I've done about 8 years of research in. It's called Bharatpur. It's one of the largest cities. So you'll see these very rural images or contexts about 10 minutes away from these very urban landscapes with the new shopping mall that was built in a time of load shedding, as well as this road where you have pedestrians, auto rickshaws, bicycles, motorcycles, and cars and buses and not trains, but trucks. You'll also see these types of images of, or these types of situations of the physical infrastructure in Bharatpur, where some residents do not have access to good quality basic infrastructure of water and sanitation, as well as the quality of the roads being very problematic in some parts. But what I'm going to talk to you about for the next few minutes is something different. I'm going to bring you to spaces where the middle class are, the slightly more affluent, and for you to think about or to hear about what they're doing in terms of the physical environment. So this is a very common site that you will see in Bharatpur, where the fertile agricultural land is being built upon. And this has been happening for about 10 years. So I'm going to tell you two short stories or two short examples of communications that I've had with the local government authority in Bharatpur. So in 2014, in November, a senior Bharatpur official was discussing the difficulties related to urban planning and land use planning in his city. He said that the municipality was in a quandary. It has its hands tied. This was due to the increasing levels of responsibility given by the central government, with insufficient political, financial, and technical resources to implement everything that was expected of the local level. He continued by saying, people purchase agricultural land and then build houses on it, and then subsequently receive planning permission from the municipality. So even in 2014, this was an illegal practice, but this official acknowledged that his municipality was retroactively approving illegal construction. In 2015, after the earthquake, or around the same time, the municipality became a sub-metropolitan city, and now it's a metropolitan city. So the population went from about 170,000 to about 300,000 now, and the area doubled, primarily jungle land and agricultural land. So now, in 2017, the government official told me, who's leading urban planning, that he echoed his colleagues' earlier comments from 2014. Now that we have 29 wards, it's more complicated. The area of the city is too big. In the near future, there will be a master plan and a land use plan, but at the moment, there's no demarcation of land use, and people will be angry that agricultural land cannot become residential. It's easy on paper, but in reality, it's difficult to implement. So this book chapter sheds a glimpse into the everyday realities of a country and a city that's overlooked in urban theory, even though the everyday reality of Bharatpur and Nepal is undoubtedly more similar to more parts of the world than the global North's reality. I think it's really important for academic discourse to generate inquiries, concepts, theory, and policy language that shapes the way that we think about the urban from places that are here, using Gautam Band's language from 2019, places where the world's population actually lives. Administrative changes matter. There was a political struggle in Nepal on a ministerial level. And so before the changes, policies were done on an informal level. So it depended on who people knew, they were able to get things done. After the constitution was passed and after there was decentralization in Nepal, there is this momentum being built to implement the laws that are there. But now change will occur incrementally. And in my opinion, this change is happening from the city center out. So the places where the local government officials have relationships, which are based on family and social networks, they are trying to implement the law. In places where they do not have relationships, they are not trying to implement the law because they don't have this informal power in order to implement the law. Not only that, they don't have the financial resources to actually implement the land use plan. So this slide is not readable. I'm putting it up here in case you wanted to take a screenshot of it so that you can see a summary of the chapter, because more or less my chapter is arguing that depending on local government status, it then influences whether they use their knowledge informally and manage the land use informally or incrementally. Now, for the last few minutes that I have, I wanted to say that, what does this actually mean? Oftentimes when I think about environmental justice, I think about the impact on the very poor and those most marginalized. And what would it do to environmental justice if we actually put the lens, a bit earlier, when we start thinking about the very rich, those who are actually making the changes, those who actually influence the local governments, the rich, those with connections. What does this do for food security in Nepal when the fertile agricultural land is being used for housing rather than food production? What does this mean long-term? When will the government start implementing the law? When they decide to do it on those who are not high caste Brahmins and Kshatris, but on those who are homeowners and landowners who are of the ethnic groups? I don't know. Those are just some of the things that I think about now. If I actually had to rework my research through the gaze of environmental justice. So in the few seconds that I have left, I just wanted to ask you to come join us. Join us in shifting the gaze to these cities that are not very well explored, but where most of the world's population lives. We're young scholars, we're really trying, and I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was great. So we have next Erwin. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. Let me just share my screen in 2 seconds. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Cassidy. It is with great privilege to be among a wonderful panelists as part of this dialogue and development. I want to thank you again for the invitation to be part of this conversation, but I also want to thank you for the support from Alex and Latavia for organizing this event and Karina for interpreting this dialogue. It is also with great appreciation to see friends, colleagues, and comrades among the participants, especially those who are joining from Indonesia, who is attending this event at a very late in the evenings in the midst of really increasing and alarming rate of COVID-19 infection across secondary cities in Indonesia, not only capital city of Jakarta. I'm forever thankful for your interest and participations. I think before sharing my reflection with the topic, I would like to briefly share my background, yes, that will tell you about my interest with overlooked cities. I was a development practitioner for a couple of years in the beginning of my career, where I'm engaged in coordinating urban climate resilience action in several secondary cities in Indonesia. I was an urban planner by training, but then shifted my attention to human geography during my postgrad studies. And currently my research is interested with politics and governance of climate change adaptation, in particularly from small and medium-sized cities. And I think in conversation with Solde and Hannah in this short talk, I'll share my observation since engaging with overlooked cities with 2 elements, overlookedness and shifting the gaze in environmental justice. First, overlookedness. I would like to begin with this graph because it really represents overlookedness, especially in the context of climate change literature. This graph was published in Nature Climate Change Journal and written by William Lamb and colleague in 2019, and depict the different level of over and underrepresentation of cases in urban mitigation research. They review more than 4,000 case study publications to determine the imbalance of review across different urban typology from small, medium, large, and mega cities. And we can see here small cities are widely under-theorized. Therefore, we argue in our book, and as Isolde shown earlier, that engaging with overlooked cities means remapping our analysis and countering the underrepresentation of these cities In contrast to global world mega and dominant cities, overlookings move beyond the limit of cities and urban center as a special container, but rather asking, how does this map can disrupt established cartographic representations? What are the political implication of highlighting the cities over, let's say, national capital? And to quote from Naomi Oreskes in her latest book, Science on Emissions, every history is a history of choices made and not made, path taken and foregone. Every history of science is a history both knowledge produced and of ignorance sustained. And for me, Overlooked Cities as part of the book project and broadly as an academic commitment provide an opportunity, forum, and solidarity of dialogue, exchange, and transversal learning over the last at least 2 years of what does it mean to think about, write from, and engage with overlooked cities. Second, shifting the gaze. I want to use this opportunity to illustrate the tension between overlooked cities and dominant cities. And in this context, I want to turn your attention to the Indonesian case on how urban problem of the capital cities render problematic compared to non-capital, non-dominant, non-mega cities, or what we call here overlooked cities. In the context of climate change, Jakarta has been at the center of the debate around the securitization of the capital city as a result of a complex interplay of ecological degradations, climate change securitization, and further intertwined with post-colonial imagination that as a nation, we never design our own capital. And lastly, with the idea of futuristic design. And in the result, the current President Joko Widodo speed up the legal arrangements to move the capital to East Kalimantan in Borneo Island, one of the biggest world forest area by 2024 or at the end of his final terms. So on the left side, you can see the different element of futurity of the capital city from smart, ecological, and forest city. So like a comprehensive futuristic design of the capital. The new capital will receive a large investment fund equal to almost close to 25 billion pounds sterling. But on the opposite, Bontang, a small city with 200 population with approximately just 100 kilometers from the new capital location, is struggling in coping up from the new normality of climate change impact. And in her last visit to our university, the mayor of Bontang expresses the need of extra funding of 27 million euros to fund their climate actions, including to build a flood control, a revitalization of lake, and build their polder and drainage systems. And in short, this shows really the tension between the dominant or capital city and overlooked cities, that the discourse of a marginal, peripheral, and on the edge of the new capital seems to again dominate overlooked cities. While the capital city receives massive funding allocation, national commitment, and national policy and political commitment, overlooked cities render to be entrepreneurial in facing the climate crisis. Overlooked cities have to navigate, negotiate, and in some instance, oppose the varying spectacle and eventualities of unequal global urbanisms that will define their urban futurity. With an appreciation that I welcome the government of Indonesia to publish a grand-setting agenda of climate resilience development, but I cautious on how overlooked cities or small secondary cities will be meaningfully and justly placed in the document. So therefore, I mean, you know, in relation and in a conversation with the topic of this talk, this dialogue, shifting the case in environmental justice for me is asking this question: what forms of inequity, injustice are occurring in overlooked cities that sustain the urban knowledge ignorance? How overlooked cities negotiate and oppose the global circuit of power and domination in climate change negotiation and actions? And what is the role of academia and urban practitioners to foreground the debate to this alternative overlooked space? from the city that you may never heard here. So these are the list of cities that I've interacted with, and for me, I think sustain ongoing overlookedness. So from Ambon, from Kupang, Manado, Blitar, Probolinggo, Metro to Semarang. Finally, I want to reiterate that for overlooked cities is an intellectual and critical commitment. And to reiterate and echo from Hannah, please join us. And we hope Overlooked Cities will inspire urban scholar, urban practitioner to revisit and reorient our attention to the urban majority of overlooked cities in reimagining our collective urban future. I'll stop there and over to Eva. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. That was very interesting. Eva and Julia are presenting together.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today and for the invitation. It's so nice always to come back to the DPU environment. And so thank you very much. And for everyone who is also joining at different time frames from different places. So it's great to have you all here. So Julia and I will be talking about one of the chapters of the book that we also wrote together with Cassidy Johnson, who is chairing this event, but which is also more broadly the result of having been part of this collective experience of contributing to this book and learning from all the cities which are within this book. And the title of our book is Intermediate Cities as Urban Innovators, an analysis of disaster risk management in Santa Fe in Argentina and Manizales in Colombia. Now, if we place our chapter in the context of today's discussion about shifting the gaze by embracing this notion of overlookedness, the main contribution perhaps of our chapter is an invitation to look at these two cities differently, and by putting our bifocal perspective on overly and overlooked cities. What do we mean by this? Well, especially for those of you who are part of the disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management community, you have probably read a lot about Manizales and also perhaps more recently about Santa Fe, and how these two cities have been framed and portrayed not just in the literature, but also in international policy circles as role models or flagship cases in DRM or DRR and also urban resilience. But they have been less interrogated in terms of their distinctive attributes around intermediariness and what is the intermediary character and role that they play in the context and in the countries in where they are embedded. And in that sense, what we try to do in this chapter is to shift the gaze and to look beyond these well-established narratives and discourses about the cities, and not just thinking about Santa Fe as a resilient city or thinking about Manizales as an exemplar in DRM, but also opening up the space for start thinking about and for giving a space for other kind of narratives and other kind of gazes that are also more provocative, counter-hegemonic, they're more pluralistic. And then it can also surprise us in what we can see and what we can find when we shift the gaze in what we are looking in these cities. So for us, there is an analytical value in approaching these cities through this bifocal perspective, but there is also there are also political implications in the way that we produce knowledge and that we also share knowledge about what we study and the way that we study these cities. Perhaps what is important is also to kind of position ourselves and say from where we are coming from. We haven't started writing this chapter thinking about overlookedness or overlooked cities. We precisely started and we focus on these two cases as individual researchers, Julia looking at Manizales during her PhD, and myself looking at Santa Fe during my PhD as well. And precisely we started by paying attention to these cities because they were relatively successful cities in this particularly field of DRM and DRR. But then when we started to dialogue and to talk between each other about what was actually making these cities so successful in those realms, we started to also to find out certain commonalities beyond the typical attributes that we will focus when thinking about disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. And that's where we also started to thinking about the intermediary role of these cities. But it was not until we joined, as I said, this collective exploration and this dialogue with other cities in the book, that this notion of overlookedness started to also become embedded and to inform what we are writing about in this chapter. So what we are trying to say here is that we also learn quite a lot and develop and shift our own gaze while being part of a collective experience in writing this book. And I think that's also quite interesting. Now, why is overlookedness as an analytical lens relevant for those who research and who also enact policies in cities? For us, we would like to highlight at least 3 areas in where we think overlookedness as an analytical lens can be useful. In the first place, for DRR scholars and practitioners, but also I'm thinking more in terms of methodological approaches in the way that we approach like the comparison or the way that we look at cities in a comparative way, but trying to also advocate for this idea of comparative learning through dialogue. And finally, also in looking at the future, perhaps it's also something that it can help us activate new type of research agendas. And I will give the floor now to Julia to give us some specific examples about how this can be advanced forward.
Thanks, Eva. So yeah, as Eva mentioned, I think our starting point was the capacities of these 2 medium-sized cities and how they're being innovative in local disaster risk management. And the terminology or the kind of literature that we used to look at them more closely was that of intermediary cities, because the term intermediary resonates very closely with cities that are outward looking, which are essential in networks of cities and territories because they're, for example, transport hubs or hubs in the service sector. And Bolay and Rabinovich have developed a really useful list of attributes, characteristics, which you can see in the bullet points, but which we haven't treated like a checklist, but we've rather thought about like, okay, how can we put them to work in how they're shaping and are being shaped by disaster risk management in both cities. So just to, for those of you who don't know those 2 cities, Manizales and Santa Fe are both well consolidated cities. They have relatively stable population numbers of between 370,000 and 400,000 inhabitants respectively. And just like one tiny example of how we were putting that characteristic of the educational and institutional relevance to work. This is reflected, for example, in how key actors from universities shape policies through consultancies, through training and capacity building, or through becoming university staff. So in Santa Fe, for example, the new mayor who took office in December 27, which was when disaster risk management was defined as a state policy in the urban development plan, he was formerly the provost of the local university. And there have been former university staff who were key people in the communication department, which, who have been very central to nurturing that diffusion of Santa Fe discourse as like the flood resilient cities. And in Manizales, for example, there's the National University of Colombia and particularly the Institute of Environmental Studies. And they have been very instrumental in the disaster risk management approach. One aspect, for example, because the university has a longevity, beyond government periods, which is very beneficial, for example, for longitudinal data on risk, on vulnerability, and on general environmental factors. But they've also provided continued training of professionals from Manizales and other Colombian regions, as well as Latin America, the Caribbean, to really also diffuse concepts and to make sure that there is a new generation of disaster risk managers that are also placed and embedded into the city and learning from the city context. Now, I think that tiny example illustrates in terms of the overly and overlookedness dialectic. Precisely the relational understanding that Isolde pointed out at the beginning, which is kind of like running through the book. Because on the one hand, it helps us to better understand the emergence, the consolidation of enabling environments for innovation in disaster risk management, which we think like is really crucial to facilitate learning from, you know, those cities that are often labeled as those that are hosting good practices. And on the other hand, we also think that that lens of the overlookedness helps us to shift the gaze to other policy realms beyond disaster risk management, and to think about those, you know, theoretical, the practical implications of a politics of representation. That, you know, you put a flashlight on certain innovative disaster risk management practices in Manizales and Santa Fe, but you simultaneously obscure other policy arenas in the very same cities. Eva, can you go to the next? So in reflection on the dialogical comparative approach, I think I'd like to highlight two elements that I think for us have been quite productively. First, I think that that idea of a dialogue has lent itself to reflections that are very open. And as Eva said, like we have taken a lot of different turns, which I think was very useful in understanding what, you know, the outside of the book with, you know, the call for understanding cities in their own terms, how that could actually look like methodologically, without falling into the trap of just putting another label or another category or another classification on them. And then second, I think we also think that that comparative perspective is really important when we think about expanding the dialogue. So as Eva has suggested, Manizales and Santa Fe are a bit of outliers in the book, precisely because they're known as overly looked at urban innovators. And they're already very prominent in certain research and policy cycles. But I think what we want to argue is that those innovative cities are an important part of the book. And that the discourse on overlooked cities precisely because of their disruptive potential. Because, you know, having that transversal dialogue between, you know, the Santa Fe's, the Bharatpurs, the Tzwanes is pluralizing, and it helps us in our debates on overlooked cities because it can challenge the hierarchies in knowledge production as well as, you know, the inequalities that Erwin talked about before that come with those hierarchies. Next one. Which brings me to the final point. We think that the overlookedness perspective has real potential to activate research agendas, as Hannah and then also Erwin and Isolde have all outlined. And I want to put on the table perhaps two issues regarding environmental justice debates or how we could relate to them. First, I think that our dialogue has shown us that overlookedness contributes to that relational perspective. So the relations between overly and overlookedness, the relations between the different characteristics of intermediary cities, and not treating them as a descriptive checklist, but really as a relational enabling environment. And the relation that I also just mentioned before about comparative and transversal dialogues between cities and city networks. And the second aspect in regards to environmental justice thinking, I think is quite useful in thinking through the three dimensions which David Schlossberg uses to provoke in-depth exploration into overlooked cities. So I think we all have a tendency, or maybe I'm speaking too much for myself, but we have a tendency to start with the where in overlooking, so the distributional aspects of overlooking. And Schlossberg's framework is a really useful reminder that we equally talk about the how, who, and the so what. So in our case, distribution, recognition, and participation, which are the three areas, means putting explicit bifocals on questions of the geographies of risk and risk management, on the recognition, the representation of identities of those who live at risk, those who manage it, about the process of decision-making for specific DRM strategies, and also the process of how good practice discourses are established and narrated from global to local levels and the other way around. Final one, Eva. So to wrap up, for us, I think the bifocal lens on overly and overlooked cities offers a lot more to unpack and to think much deeper in regards to shifting the gaze in disaster risk management, in comparative dialogues, and in research agenda. And I think in this regard, it's always worth recalling and recognizing and engaging with the many president and sister discussions that are nurturing our debates. So I'm finishing with a quote from Karen Levy's paper in Environment Urbanization from '92, where she uses the bifocals as a framework to bring together, in her case, gender and environmental debates. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Eva and Julia, and also a very interesting presentation. We have a little bit of time, about 15 minutes for a question and answer and discussion amongst the panel. So if there's anyone from the attendees who has a question, if you'd like to put it into the Q&A function, we can ask it. And I think I might ask my panelists just to pick up on the question that Julia raised at the end around Schlossberg's framework and thinking about environmental justice through the lenses of distribution, recognition, and participation. I think, well, Isolde, you didn't get to talk a lot about your work in the book, but you could also talk about that perhaps now in this part. Do you think that the things that you've raised in your presentation, or from what you've seen in your research in these cities, you know, to what extent does this framework start to unpack the environmental justice issues? And I think, Hannah, you talked about a lot about food security. And then when I was looking at those examples, I was thinking also, well, it's quite, I wonder, you know, what's going to happen in 10, 15, 20 years with all of this sort of illegal development in terms of, you know, creating new cities and the kinds of risks those create. So of course there's food security, but also potentially a lot of potential disaster issues there. And Erwin, in terms of, you know, the ways that these, you know, these smaller cities, you know, just don't have the light shone on them and don't have the capacities in order to address these big issues in the way that the bigger cities have. So I would welcome you to each make some comments. I don't know who would like to start.
I will start.
Nice
you can
to
follow the
you.
same order. So let me maybe say a bit. I'll have to join in she'll have to join in the conversation. In my chapter, so I look at the spatial coming from law, I look at the spatial justice lens. And in my chapter, I engage with the work of social legal theorist Mariana Valverde, who argues for a feminist approach to spatial justice, and argues specifically on shifting the scale of our inquiry in these spaces. So I think that when looking at distribution, recognition, participation, and looking at, so if I take the ideas of spatial justice and shift them to environmental justice, I think that the same ideas around a shift in scale is important, and I do think that the notion of overlooked cities, minor cities, ordinary cities, smaller cities, medium, even if these, and I do think that is why the chapters of Eva and Julia, that chapter is, and with your contribution also, Cassidy, why that is an important chapter, because within these cities there are different scales. And I think ordinary cities also calls for a scale shift. And I do think that definitely foregrounds the questions of participation, of distribution, and of recognition. So I think from a theoretical perspective, I think these ideas of spatial justice can contribute to environmental justice if we think about it in terms of a scale shift. And I think their feminist theory is helpful because, and maybe feminist theory to an extent has left that behind, the interrogation of the domestic sphere or the smaller, the ordinary spaces. And I do think that there's a renewed call and urgency to think about these smaller scale inquiries. So yes, that from my view, our view.
Thank you very much. Hannah?
Thank you for the question. When I think about distribution, recognition, and participation, I agree with Isolde about the shift in scale. And there's something about the word closeness that works for me. You know, the distance of people to the local authority, the trust, the informal social networks. And I think that there's also some really interesting work in India at the moment. I just can't tell you who did it. The woman just produced a book about it. And it interrogates, in this book that I cannot name, the corridor from Delhi and how these small cities are changing, and the elites, landowners, and some of that is based on you know, historical understandings of the caste and family networks, is in tension with businesses that are coming through this economic corridor. So I think there's a lot to think through in terms of closeness of people and power. And I'm hopeful. I think that Nepal, I think they want to do the right thing. Yeah, so I think it's in flux, but almost in a positive way. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Eva, did you want to, or Erwin?
Probably a quick note from your question, Cassidy. One thing that I've tried to bring for ground is that to avoid the idea of hierarchy among cities, and to think about how does the overlooked city small city can contribute in terms of the debate and discussion around scale trap and the idea of scale and scaling in climate change. I think in the last engagement that we have with Dordrecht in the Netherlands. So I think where does the overlooked city has brought me is not beyond the global south, but also how does it engage in the global north? Is that thinking Dordrecht, a small island city in the Netherlands, are situated in a complex interway that it's influenced the national economy of the Netherlands, but they would also add a value in terms of thinking how climate change is being mediated through social and cultural processes. So in Dordrecht, they have initiated in terms of thinking about the relationship between water security and climate adaptations. And the value that they bring from the smaller city is thinking about the cross intersection between individuality and collective reliance in a smaller city. So that tells the scale social network in smaller overlooked cities compared to bigger major cities. Thank you.
Good. We also have, Eva, I don't know if you want to answer on that one. There's also 2 questions here that might be interesting questions to answer.
Yeah, perhaps I would add something around the way that I used to look at environmental justice was mostly by thinking about also the injustices within the cities in terms of differentiating social groups, differentiating social identities. But perhaps in this book, because we are talking about cities, so we also need to start thinking about the implications of justice in the way that we think about cities in relation to the others. And there is also the risk when we talk about these innovative cities and cities that are exemplars of leaving aside other cities. And so that was also something that has been constantly in my mind when I kept talking about Santa Fe as being an exemplar in DRM, and also who has been recognizing the work of this city. So they haven't been recognized, at least in the case of Santa Fe, in their national context. They have been mostly recognized by international organizations and international funders, that they are also in a way excluding other cities in the way that they provide funding, in the way these city-to-city networks, and not all of them are open to all cities. So there might be also environmental justice implications in how exclusionary these kind of city-to-city networks might be by just recognizing the work or just acknowledging what seems to work according to them. So I think we also need to have a critical perspective on how we think about these innovative or cities, which is for me has been very inspirational also to try to start to think about what things can be actually be done, and not just always like thinking that these kind of cities or certain types of cities have no capacities, and everything is kind of predetermined, and there are no pathways for changing. But also we also need to keep that kind of into perspective of who we are not perhaps, or which kind of cities we're living and putting aside, but not focusing on them. I don't know, Julia, if you want to add something.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. There's also a question there about enabling environments. What were the attributes and pathways to make cities enabling environments?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Vanessa. So I think the way or why we got interested into these enabling environments is because if we look at Manizales and Santa Fe only as medium-sized cities and then start comparing them, we were kind of like falling short in two regards. One was that we couldn't really explain why those two as intermediate or as medium-sized cities were successful, why others in the same countries weren't. And then the second was why they were successful or innovative in disaster risk management, but not in other policy arenas. And so the idea of the enabling environment as something that is not like a static list of characteristics, but something that is really, being shaped and is something that is kind of like, constantly being made and remade, and that has a long history, and that is much more complex than saying, you need to have, a good local government, political will at the local government. You need to have this kind of resources. You need to have this kind of legal norms and frames and so on. I think the enabling environment precisely helps us to kind of like break open a bit that question of like what are the attributes and pathways to really understand more the processes behind them, and how they're coming into being. But I think in both cases, where we found the similarities between Santa Fe and Manizales was on the one hand, you obviously have a particular history of decentralization that I know Vanessa knows probably much better than I do. And then, they're both university towns. They're both well consolidated. They both have very solid institutions, relatively little political change over a couple of periods. They both have been impacted by disaster events at different scales and with different severity. So there were certain commonalities that kind of stimulated why disaster risk management is on the political agenda in both cities and stays on that political agenda. But then there were also so many other factors that are because of their intermediary characteristics as, port city, a transport node, et cetera, that just allowed them to, actually actualize, what they needed to do when they were faced and confronted with those disasters. I'm not sure if I should. I'm seeing that there's more questions coming in.
Yeah, I think we're just about out of time. So maybe we have two. We can answer Hannah's going to answer Khalid's question by writing. Antonius was asking, does the concept of environmental justice that you use refer to only human beings or also non-human entities? Would it be possible to include environmental justice to non-human entities in the kind of research that you do? And yeah, I would answer that absolutely. What would be the difficulties in doing that? Well, yeah, I think we have to look at the environment as an element of justice. Also, I think that we tend to focus on human, but there's definitely the importance of the environment, animals, plants, and all beings in part of that. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that. I see Isolde maybe has something else to say there. Oh, and Hannah's answering also by typing. Great. Good. Well, I think we're sort of, well, we're out of time, actually. So I'd like to end by thanking all of our panelists, first of all, for being part of this lively discussion today. I think, I mean, I've been a bit of an outsider in the book than many of you, but I think I've learned a lot through this idea of shifting the gaze to look at this at overlooked cities. I think it's a very, very interesting and definitely a rich area for research. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much to everyone who's attended today. And thank you for translation also into Indonesian. We really appreciate that. It's very, very wonderful to have that. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything, just ending off. Any of our panelists? No, Hannah? Okay.
No, just thank you very much for organizing this, and I really appreciate that so many people came to listen and to engage with this. Thank you.
And thank you to Alex too for all the technical
Yes.
support. Okay, everyone, we sign off then. Okay, bye-bye.